Hey everyone, it's Andrew at TheWoodenHobbyist, and today we're replacing these absolute trash bar stools I made years ago out of construction pine and dowels. Using a combo of traditional and not so traditional woodworking techniques, I was able to develop something I was super proud of. Let's get started with this gorgeous kiln-dried 8/4 walnut for the bases and this crazy looking air-dried Old Barn 5/4 walnut for the rest of the chairs. I love air-dried walnut because of the colors it brings out, and it's much easier to bend, which we'll be doing later. I'll be the very first to say I went all over the place with this build as I just had an image in my head and I didn't really plan much. Typically, I like to mill absolutely everything at once, but this turned into a mill-as-you-go sort of project. I decided to break down what I knew I needed first for the entire leg base assembly. Working with shorter pieces kept me from losing too much material during the milling process. I made sure to leave a little extra on the boards just in case I accidentally got planer snipe, and made sure to get rid of any unwanted and checked edges. I began jointing all of the air-dried walnut first because it was small enough to fit on my joiner. It was super satisfying to see what was living underneath all of that old barnwood growth. The 8/4 walnut was a different story, as I had to trim it to 8 inches on the bandsaw so it could fit on my joiner. After I got a good flat surface and a jointed edge on everything, I then put it all through the planer. I wasn't really concerned with the exact thicknesses here. I just kept planing the surface until each type of wood was the same thickness and perfectly flat. The final step of the first milling process was getting a nice glue-ready edge at the table saw. After I got the edge at the table saw, I trimmed everything to similar lengths at the miter saw. Exact length wasn't too important here because we were going to be cutting down to exact size later on. Since I didn't really know what I was doing, I figured I should just build up from the bottom, starting with the bases. Standard circular bases for chairs seem to be about 16 inches in diameter or more, so that's what I went with here. I glued these 8/4 panels up while trying to keep the best grain matchup as possible. Full disclosure, this is the first time I've used my CNC for furniture. Until now, I've only used it for jigs and templates, so I really wanted to incorporate it into a build just for the experience. I had some scrap plywood laying around and I used it to create routing templates for the legs. I needed a total of 9 legs plus a few extra for mess ups because, honestly, it seems to be inevitable at this point. Using a highly visible stain marker, I traced the template shapes on the walnut stock so removing the waste material would be a lot easier, but it also helped me with avoiding the sapwood. Then it was on to the bandsaw, which took forever. I ended up knocking out 12 total legs, so every time you see me working on these legs, just know I did each thing 12 to 24 times. I felt like I was under some sort of hypnosis, doing the same thing over and over and over again. Once they were all cut, I used double-sided tape to attach the template to each leg. This double-sided tape is my absolute favorite because it's super strong but leaves zero residue on any of my work pieces. You can actually get a pack of 8 rolls for relatively cheap, and they seem to last quite a long time. I'll leave a link in the description. Using a flush trim bit, I began trimming all the legs to the final shape of the template. This took a while, but it's ultra satisfying to see them actually take shape. And remember how I made 12? Well, I messed up 3 of them, leaving me with the exact number of legs I needed to complete all 3 chairs. Jumping back to the bases, I got to utilize my CNC again. Typically, I would use a router and a circle cutting jig to knock these out, then measure from the center for all of the mortises. It was nice not having to spend so much time doing everything by hand for once, but if you tried this project yourself without a CNC, it's totally doable without one. I didn't have a CNC bit long enough to cut all the way through the thicker stock, so, like the legs, I had to remove a bulk of the waste at the bandsaw first. Then, when everything was cut as close as I possibly could, I moved to the router table to flush up all of the rough cuts. This next part I'm particularly proud of. I wanted a large waterfall-style coved edge profile, if that even makes sense. So I clamped a scrap piece of MDF to the table saw and raised the running blade through the top. Using a straight edge, I marked a line from both sides of the blade to get a straight-on position for where to drill. Using an 1/8 inch drill bit, I drilled a few holes along the marked straight edge to give myself options on sizes. Using that same 1/8 inch drill bit, I drilled a hole through the center of my workpiece and used it as a pivoting pin for the cove cuts. Final step was to turn the table saw on and raise the blade about 1/8 of an inch per pass until I reached my desired depth for the edge. It was super messy, but the end result was totally worth it. I set the bases and legs aside and milled up some more walnut for the final piece of the total leg assembly. It wasn't anything special, just a square with corresponding mortises to tie everything together. I cut out the exact shape I needed on the CNC, then moved to the router table for a 1/4 inch round over. I know I could have completely cut out the mortises at the CNC, but I'm weird and I really enjoyed plucking them out with a chisel. I needed to cut tenons on the legs, so I decided the easiest way to knock these out on the curved surfaces would be the router table. Using a 1/2 inch straight bit, I slowly pass each leg over the fence and remove material until they fit the width of the mortises. To fit lengthwise, I had to go old school. I clamped each leg down to my workbench and removed the extra material with a handsaw and chisel. This took absolutely forever, but due to the curvature of the legs, it seemed to be the only way to knock it out. I added a 1/4 inch round over to all of the legs and then moved on to sanding each piece of the base assembly. For the round bases, I used a sanding pad attachment to blend everything. I use a 3M extract sandpaper because it doesn't leave squiggly marks and is highly efficient in removal. Once everything was sanded, I knew I wanted to reinforce the legs, so I pre-drilled holes through the mortises, all the way through to the bottom, so I knew exactly where to recess holes for screw heads and where to place the screws in general. I wanted a raw, natural look, so I applied Rubio Monocoat Pure as the finish. Most other walnut items I made for my home are finished the same exact way, so I feel it works best for continuity. You just spread it around and watch that beautiful walnut grain pop. I buffed it with a white abrasive pad and wiped away all of the excess after a few minutes. It's super simple and it's dust free. To help with keeping the bases flat, I added 6 rubber feet to distribute the weight and allow the wood to breathe underneath. Glue up was simple since I took the time to prepare. Just some tight bond and hand pressure until I could flip everything around and secure it with screws. Some woodworkers still scoff at using screws. I don't. They're not visible and I think they add a great deal of reinforcing. Screws wouldn't even exist if they weren't necessary from time to time. The final step for the leg assembly was to secure the swivel. I feel all bar stools should have a swivel and a backrest. This particular swivel was rather cheap, but it's super solid and spins on bearings. I'll leave a link below if you want some for your own bar stool builds. Speaking of swivels and backrests, I decided to wing it for this next step. Sean decided to come over and stop being lazy. He milled up some more air-dried walnut for the seats and backrests. We followed the same process, so I'll spare your attention span from that. I designed a cool looking seat and used a CNC to cut it out, along with a recessed area for the swivel hardware to rest inside of. This recessed area lowers the seat a bit and hides the hardware better. Sean added a 1/4 inch round over to the top and an 1/8 inch round over to the bottom before passing them off to me to sand through the grits. Since I used 3M extract sandpaper and used Rubio Monocoat, I typically only sand with 120 and 180 grit, which is ideal for limiting time sanding all of these pieces. Once the seats were completed, I wrapped my head around the idea of bent backrests. I resawed a bunch of walnut and a little bit of maple to knock out some bent lamination. I ran everything through the drum sander until they could comfortably bend around a 40-inch diameter curve. I cut out a bunch of MDF forms which had a 40-inch diameter curve across the top. Using dowels to keep them aligned and brad nails to hold them together, Sean stacked them until we had 2 solid forms to bend the laminations over. For the bending process, I used Unibond 1 cold pressed veneer glue because it dries way harder than your standard PVA glue. This means it's much more likely to hold the bent form without any bounce back. I used tape to assist in holding the laminations somewhat centered to the forms and place them in a vacuum press. The vacuum press applies more than enough clamping pressure, but Sean thought it was a good idea to add a little bit more with his extreme sucking skills. While those were drying, I pulled out this old slab I've had for a while to work on the backrest attachment piece thingy. I just milled them up and cut them out on the CNC, and they were really just an altered rectangle design. I honestly didn't have to use the CNC here, but why not? This slab was air dried and had some crazy color to it, so I thought it was perfect for such a highly visible piece of the stool. To get that lean effect, I set my miter saw to 5 degrees and cut the bottom of each piece. This slight angle adds an enormous amount of comfort. I added some Rubio to both of the pieces we just worked on and thought for about 5 seconds on how to attach them. Yep, you guessed it, screws again, and epoxy. I used the tips of the screws as point finders to pre-drill into the end grain. I then drove 3 2.5-inch screws directly into the backrest after adding some epoxy as well. This turned out to be more than enough to hold everything together while in use. The final step was to finish up the backrest. I removed them from the forms and ripped up some straight edges on the bandsaw. I cut them to width at a 10-degree angle just for aesthetic purposes. I finally got to add finish to these pieces and was blown away at the color and figure of this air-dried walnut. You'll probably notice some weird small pieces to the side. Well, those are part of the footrest assembly, and I'm not showing how I made them because I don't feel like they're strong enough. I'm going to figure out a way to make a cast iron version instead, so follow me on all of my socials, which would be TheWoodenHobbyist, if you want to see how they are updated in the future. I finally got to attach all of the pieces and see them come together as a full unit. I'm super happy with the overall turnout, and these stools are definitely conversation starters. I'm thinking about making templates available on my website as well. So let me know in the comments what you think of these stools, or if I should even make templates available for others to easily make them themselves. I'll leave a cool woodworking playlist here and in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe because I have a lot more coming. Thanks for watching. Happy building.